An update on a story we reported here last night. JP Morgan Chase is taking responsibility and agreeing to pay a settlement of $1.7 billion to victims of Bernie Madoff's massive Ponzi scheme for turning a blind eye to what the Justice Department says were obvious signs of money laundering, among other things. The bank will pay another $350 million to federal banking officials to settle civil charges. U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara of New York City, the lead prosecutor in the case, says the bank failed miserably, in his words, to head off Wall Street's biggest ever swindle, even as the bank, exited Madoff-related positions that put its own capital at risk.
JP Morgan never filed a single suspicious activity report in the United States and never raised a concern to the bank's anti-money laundering department in the U.S. In other words, the bank connected the dots when it mattered to its own profit, but was not so diligent when it came to its legal obligations.
No individuals at the bank were charged with any wrongdoing, but the bank itself faces 2 felony criminal counts for violating the Bank Secrecy Act. Those charges are deferred for now and will be lifted in 2 years pending the payments and reforms of JP Morgan's anti-money laundering practices.
With today's settlement, the grand total of fines that JP Morgan has paid is about $20 billion. But investors don't seem to mind. The bank's stock has soared in the past year, rising almost 30%. So do these big fines really matter? We turn to John Coffey for some answers. He's professor of securities law at Columbia University. You know, Jack, it's not just JP Morgan we're talking about here. There's sort of a pattern. And whether it's another financial institution, another bank, they get the fines, their stocks still go up. So it makes you wonder, do these fines really change anything?
Well, I'm afraid they are not the optimal means of deterrence. When you impose a fine on a large public corporation, you're really imposing it on the shareholders. And the shareholders of JP Morgan are very numerous, very dispersed, very diffused, and they can't take collective action. Now, if JP Morgan had a controlling shareholder, $20 billion in fines would clearly motivate a response. But if you've got millions of shareholders who can't take collective action, management remains in control and aren't being measurably affected by shareholder dissatisfaction. Thus, I think the fine strategy has to be seen as second best. Not ineffective, but second best. What would really work is being able to focus the penalties more on individuals, either individually or collectively.
So why, John, don't prosecutors or regulators at the SEC go after individuals? I assume it's because individuals fight the charges because either their career or their freedom is at risk. Obviously, you can't have bad behavior without individuals committing it.
I agree with you fully, but let me give you the 3 basic reasons why it's very hard to prosecute individuals. American criminal law insists on proof of willfulness, not simply that you were negligent or you should have known better, but that you willfully aided and abetted the fraud or sought to cause it. That's a very high standard because we don't want to send people to prison very easily. That's reason 1. Reason 2, if you look at our large corporations, the organizational structure there is extremely decentralized, and it is hard to hold people at the top liable for decisions that were made echelons below at operational levels, which aren't really monitored by management. And that's what's different in these bank cases from, say, Enron and WorldCom. There we were dealing with decisions that were cook-the-book decisions made by senior management. Here, when we deal with mortgage securitizations, that's going on down at the level of majors and captains, and you can't say the general knew all about that. And finally, and the worst reason, enforcers and regulators would rather settle than fight because they're risk-averse, and it's easier to get a settlement from the entity, which will almost always settle, than fight the government. But the condition for that settlement may sometimes be that you don't go after the individuals, and that's the bargain that I'm afraid is sometimes there.
All right, so understand those circumstances. Do you think that there is going to be any change in corporate cultures, corporate behavior, and even individual behavior, given all of these fines that we're seeing in settlements everywhere?
Oh, some change. Remember that what's probably most effective here is that senior management at a company like JP Morgan has been very embarrassed. And that embarrassment is a form of deterrence, and they are probably going to insist on more compliance. Our problem is always that compliance works well during a stormy period, But once you get back into a bubbly market, the compliance officer gets a good deal less respect. So I think there are changes. I think the government is definitely getting tougher, and I think management has been embarrassed. But I don't think shareholders can enforce tougher law compliance on management.
Okay. All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much. John Coffey, law professor at Columbia University.